you think of companies that you must come up against this, where you have these brand documents that have so many rules? And I'll give you an example. I won't mention the client's name, but I always mention it because I find it hilarious. Where we created a comic strip to introduce a very technical IT service, and they came back to me after it had gone through their brand guidelines and PR guidelines and said, "John, we like the comic strip, but can you remove the humour and make it more realistic?" How often do you have to deal with that kind of brand guidelines that are that strict that it makes it very difficult for you to create good advertising?
One of the things it shows is that, of course, brand guidelines are it's a bit like actually any kind of legislation, which is it's often very, very bad at dealing with the unexpected, just as you know, libel and defamation legislation is very bad at coping with Twitter. And that attempt to codify everything, perfectly understandable, is it's a natural instinct. And there are, by the way, there are brands where in some ways the entire game, where I'm defensive, is there are certain brands where the entire game is consistency. That's what the consumer effectively buys. They buy into the fact that there are no surprises. But on the other hand, you can make the case that attempting to codify something as complex as communication is a dangerous game to play. I think what it also does is explain, this is where Oglivy talks about the big ideal to a great extent, which is that we need a kind of meta definition. What is this brand for? What role does it fulfill? Why does it do what it does? Is more useful in a way of aligning all your communications than attempting to write legislation for an uncertain future. I think that is an important point. You do need some sort of, start with why, as Simon Sinek says. You do need some sort of, overarching idea of what a brand's for. Before you can really write those guidelines, because those guidelines should be based on the overarching purpose, not so much on sort of the style manual approach.
You do see, I've seen a lot of very good brand guideline documents, but do you ever see some of them where you can tell this, this is of no value at all, it's just fluff? You see there's a lot in fashion and a lot of brands like that.
If the ratio of abstract nouns becomes over 40%, you've got a problem. I think that's fair. And particularly if they're kind of meaningless wish list abstract nouns. We only really take seriously information that involves a bit of a mental trade-off. So reassuringly expensive is interesting. We like that because there's a little bit of a trade-off there, and we can kind of believe it. Okay, it's expensive, but it's worth paying for. That's reassuringly expensive. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, which was written by Salman Rushdie when he worked here, bizarrely. That also is honest about what the trade-off is. And we tend to absorb that information, and Robert Cialdini has done work on this, much more contentedly than we pay attention to information that's purely all positive puffery. And yet so many guidelines are written and so many propositions are written as if we must obviously only talk about the good things. That I think there's a psychological disconnect there, because we tend to actually mentally depreciate information which isn't costly to say. And if you want to get into this whole thing, there's a whole area in evolutionary biology. It's Amos Zahavi's costly signalling theory. But generally, we take seriously a piece of communication in proportion to what it costs, not only in money, but in effort. What it costs the sender to actually say it. And therefore, merely meaningless boasting actually has very, very little traction. And yet most propositions are written as though obviously that's all we can possibly do. And so the freedom to allow your corporate Twitter voice to actually engage in a bit of self-deprecation or the occasional negative is actually essential to being taken seriously.
That's it's Warren Buffett. He always starts his presentations with bad news. Because then everything else you say has more credibility.
I seem to remember one year his annual talk started with basically you would have all been better off if I'd stayed in bed this year. So no, I mean again disarming candour you could call it. Robert Cialdini's talked about the fact that actually one of the almost universal techniques of salesmanship is actually to provide the negative, naughty but nice, on the grounds that if you don't provide the negative, the actual consumer will imagine lots of negatives of their own. So trade-off, pick your own strawberries, we get that. Okay, I do a bit of work, I get cheaper strawberries in return for picking them myself. We're all comfortable with that. It, you know, it kind of obeys the rules of karma, if you like.
Yeah.
Cheap strawberries, that sentence, those two words tend to arouse a bit of suspicion, because it's, hold on, if my strawberries were any good, I'd charge full price for them. These strawberries must be a bit shit in some way I don't fully understand.
I like your example of Ryanair and EasyJet saying all of the services they don't offer, because otherwise you'd think you've got an amateur flying the plane.
That's an interesting thing, which is we always look at marketing as if its job is to justify a premium, a price premium.
Yeah.
But another role of marketing is actually decontaminating a low price. Because if Ryanair and particularly EasyJet hadn't made all that noise about, you know, if you think of it, it's very irrational what they were doing. They were basically making a noise in PR saying you don't get a meal, you don't get to check in luggage without paying for it, you don't get a pre-allocated seat, although you do now, admittedly. And they would actually then make all this noise about what you didn't get. Now, what on earth are they doing? Well, the argument is that if you don't do that, if you say we're just as good as British Airways, but we're cheaper, people go, well, you're obviously saving money in some area I don't understand. You know, it basically means you don't bother to service your engines and your pilots are a bit crap. So the vital thing there was to actually provide the negative. And IKEA, of course, you know, is very, very explicit. You have to assemble it yourself. The shopping experience is, you know, has an element of pain and discomfort and inconvenience in it. And that's actually important, because you go, I get it, this furniture can be high quality and inexpensive, because the trade-off I'm making isn't in quality. I'm not making a quality trade-off to achieve that low price. I'm making a kind of hassle trade-off to achieve. And we're all cool with that. You know, to pick your own strawberries is the same thing.